Hello, and welcome to Leadership in Challenging Times on the NorQuest College podcast. Hosted by Dr. Jody Abbott, President and CEO of NorQuest College, and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson, 3rd Canadian Division Headquarters with the Canadian Army, this podcast will discuss challenging and difficult topics affecting community, business, and soldiers alike. The presenters may at times express their personal opinion or take a contrary position to expand the conversation, ranging from leadership to sensitive subjects to current affairs. The podcast will tackle issues in an open manner with an eye on identifying and expanding ideas from all sides of the discussion. Jody and Jeff will now start the podcast.
Hi, everyone. Podcast number 13, Leadership in Challenging Times. We're very, very pleased today to welcome Jamil Javani. Jamil is an emerging leader who tackles some of the biggest challenges in the world today as a lawyer, a community organizer, and a teacher. He is the founder of the Citizen Empowerment Project, which is a community outreach and public education organization focused on law and policy issues of national interest. Jamil is a graduate of Yale Law School, very, very impressive, and currently teaches at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. He is born and raised in the Toronto area and has recently put out a new book, Why Young Men. It was published in April 2018. And we are very pleased to have Jamil here at NorQuest College as keynote speaker of our Civil Society Speakers Series. Welcome, Jamil.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I wonder if you could start by giving our listeners just a sense of who you are and what your story is, because I think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, well, I'm Canadian, born and raised in the Toronto area. A lot of my work comes out of a personal experience I had of being a very disengaged and low-achieving student growing up. So much so that at the age of 16, I was considered illiterate by the Ontario public school system. And I had a pretty dramatic kind of turnaround after that. By the time I was 25, I graduated from Yale Law School and was a lawyer. And so a lot of my work comes in trying to understand how those changes occurred in my life, what happened that empowered me and prepared me to achieve things I couldn't imagine growing up. And how do I replicate some of that opportunity and support and self-initiative and self-empowerment in the lives of other people? So that's a big part of my work. And I'm trained as a lawyer, but I tend to look at a lot of problems as much as I can as non-legal issues, right? How do we empower people culturally in our families and how we treat each other? I try to take a very grassroots approach to solving problems. I also grew up in a mostly newcomer community in the suburbs of Toronto. My father came to Canada from Kenya, and my mother is the daughter of Irish and Scottish immigrants to Canada after World War II. So I think my experience in cultivating an identity for myself and finding a way to feel like I belong in Canada and really coming to own my Canadian identity is also a big part of my story and a lot of what I write and talk about as well.
So just hearing that initial introduction, I would think that there's going to be a lot of linkage to NorQuest College and our student population because 60% of our student population are born outside of Canada. So I really look forward to hearing your stories and particularly of identity, of where do I fit? And we're really interested in how does that then translate into leadership, whether we are teaching in the college, whether we're middle management and working with a very diverse student population. How do we learn from you and your experiences so that we can take that into our leadership and mentorship?
And it's the same for the armed forces as well. I mean, we talked about that before we started. There's lots of relevant stuff here for everybody, every citizen in Canada. And I was really struck as I read your book and I listened to your podcast that there's the tone and the flavor of everything was about community, which I really struck me. And I would tell everybody of our listeners, you got to listen to your podcasts. Your podcast is the Road Home, right? The
Yes.
Road Home. Great guest, and the one I was saying to Jody when I came in here, your one on community safety, that fantastic. I've listened to that like 5 times now because I just think it's so relevant. But I wanted to ask you a question, sort of get the ball rolling, and I fear today that the press, media, culture, society, in some ways, social media, is framing all of our discussions around identity and everything that makes us different as people. And not enough, I think, on the common ground and community and what makes us the same. Do you want to start off talking about that?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the context I think I'm writing in or doing the work I do in is trying to build some of those linkages between people. I think it's easy for us as individuals to understand our problems in such unique ways, right? Because we are ourselves, we are so confined in some cases by our own subjectivity that it makes sense to us to think that there are things that are so unique to us that would create a unique kind of adversity or mean that we experience the world in ways that other people can't relate to. And that is true, of course, to some extent. The problem is when that becomes our defining impulse in our politics. It defines how we view broad cultural issues to the point where we underplay or completely overlook the reality that most of us have far more in common than we sometimes assume. So, for example, in all the work I do, a really common thread is that, whether I'm speaking to middle-class kids who have been in Canada for 10 generations or newcomers or people who are, live on reserves in, the middle of the country, a common thread in the lives of all these people is we have a fairly similar sense of what we'd like our life to be like, right? We want to be safe. We want to feel loved. We want to have other people we can love. We'd like maybe a bigger house or a better car or a job, right? There's such a basic sense, I think, of what a good life means for so many people. And when we lose sight of that, it means that we aren't learning from what might be working in the lives of some folks to empower others, right? Mm-hmm. Because we define everyone's problems as being so different that the solutions start to look different. But I think if you dig past our superficial differences and get a sense of what every young person, every student, everyone who just wants a different life than what they've got now, anyone who thinks the status quo isn't good enough, I think we'd like to move in a similar direction. And we do that a lot easier when we're learning from each other and supporting each other than when we're trying to fight these battles all on our own.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, do you think it's something, because we had a long discussion about social media on one of our podcasts, that social media is this great tool, but I even read in your book as well about, if you will, I use the term weaponization of Twitter and other things where it reinforces those small groups rather than bringing everybody together as a community.
Yeah, I mean, social media is one of those things which is such a high volume of messages that people are receiving. It's such a high volume of content you're being exposed to. And within that, you have such wide variability of what you could be looking at, right? Like, there are activists I know who use social media to fight the stigma against mental health, and they start amazing conversations about what people otherwise might be going through in private, right? And those are moments that remind me of the beautiful power social media can have in helping someone who might otherwise feel alone and in a state of despair, remind them that they're actually connected to a lot of other people who are feeling and experiencing the same things. But then you have the other ways that social media gets used where it actually becomes a way to further alienate you, right? Where you start to feel like everything's contentious, everything's an argument, everything's a fight. And people go on social media and all they're reminded of is negativity and toxicity in the relationships that people have with one another. So it really is one of those things where it's a bit of a black box, and it depends on how you use it and what you're exposed to, and so much of it is kind of random at the same time. There was a great conversation that Joe Rogan had on his podcast recently with the founder of Twitter, Jack Dorsey. And even I think Twitter has to recognize the broad variability of how its platform is being used, and it's hard for them to I guess cope with the reality that I don't think you can make it a purely positive tool. That there are going to be ways for people to use it in negative ways, and in some cases, I guess that's what a platform that reflects the diversity of human thoughts and experiences and political views is inevitably going to look like, right? But I think in terms of it being let's say a divisive influence, I do think social media can do that. And a lot of it comes down to those echo chambers. Like, it's scary sometimes when you look at the research of how if you hold a particular view on a subject, you could surround yourself with a social media ecosystem that never challenges your views and instead just makes you think that it is so commonsensical that everyone thinks like you, that when you encounter someone who doesn't, you think they're immoral, irredeemably flawed, a bad person. And that is such a toxic starting point for any kind of dialogue.
In relationship, I mean, you can't have that and start off with such a negativity at the start, because then you don't have, as you put, those really good conversations, those hard conversations.
So somewhat related to that, what I'm hearing is with social media, you can gravitate to something you believe that may not be positive. It could be so unique that it's grabbing you in a bad way. And something in your book that you identify is that you nearly fell into many traps that young men on a detour away from success, so pulling them away from success. And in that, what do you mean by traps? And so when you were growing up, what were those traps? And how then did you say, I'm going to steer away from them? What was it in you or in your environment, or what you sought in your environment, or what you sought from social media that helped you not to go there?
Yeah. When I say trap, I mean negative influences that convince you that you're doing the right thing.
Okay.
And because those are the ones that are hardest to get away from. So what I mean by that is, growing up in a neighborhood where, all the kids were older than the houses they lived in. And we were, either us or our parents were so new to Canada that we were in some ways left to fend for ourselves in terms of developing a culture and an identity and a community. We were drawn to the lowest hanging fruit, right? And for my generation, what was so easily available to us was pop culture that represented men and young men in particular in what I would regard as self-destructive ways, right? So criminals, gangsters, misogynists, people who used violence to express themselves, who celebrated a really kind of reckless materialism, and more, I think, harmful than anything, a certain kind of moral relativism is what I think we were introduced to. And what I mean by that is a way of thinking about the world where your own struggles define what is okay for you to do. So if you don't have enough money, it's okay to sell drugs. If you don't feel supported, you can take that anger and frustration out on someone else, right? And become a violent person. And what that meant for me was that I, glorified a certain kind of gangster subculture that was introduced to us through movies and through music. And it was a multi-billion-dollar industry that a lot of people got rich off of. But for kids who look to those entertainers as more than entertainers, but as, clerics, as role models, as almost like they're priests, right? People who are supposed to communicate wisdom to you. Then that behavior that someone might look at and say, that's just fun, we looked at it and took it really seriously, right? So when I say a trap, I mean it made us think we were being successful because we thought that's what success looked like. You get attention from girls at school. You think that you have money because you've got a bunch of cash, right? Your friends have money. Your friends are in and out of jail like the people you see in the movies, right? It feels like you're living this fairy tale life that is cool and exciting. And that's when it becomes a trap because you have a false sense of reality. And that was my particular circumstance, but I think that variations of that are true for a lot of people, right? Like even on that, when we talk about social media, so much of the challenge of social media is that it can give people false idols. It can give you someone that you look at on Instagram or Twitter, on Facebook, and you think that's what success looks like. You mimic those behaviors, you adopt that value system. But it turns out that that's actually not the key to a happy, safe, secure life, right? And I think very clearly, for instance, of Instagram models, right, that a lot of young people want to copy. But the truth is that that's not the surest path to a healthy and happy life, right? So those are the kinds of traps I mean, where you start to conflate your identity with certain behaviors that actually aren't good for you. And what that means in practice is that the things that are fundamental, like getting a basic education, thinking about what kind of career you want to have, understanding enough about how the world works so you might be in a position to own a home or a car one day, right? I mean, those kind of basics that a lot of people take for granted, you start to not even pay attention to because you're chasing something that is so fantastic, right? So those are the traps that concern me, because I think, a lot of my work focuses on young men, but this is not a problem that's unique to young men, where you have people who are so fixated on these false senses of what success looks like that they lose a lot of really important years of their life and time that they should have been learning, growing, challenging themselves. They, get swept up by ideologues, or they get swept up by crime and extremism and just ideologies that want to prey on young people who are ambitious and willing to give their life and their energy and their time to a cause, whether that cause is helping a drug dealer get rich or an extremist build a following or whatever it might be. It's a similar departure, I think, from what anyone could objectively say is good for that young person.
So given that we are a post-secondary institution and we work with young people, they've come through high school, they may be someone who's got a degree coming back. Sometimes people will be lost and they won't quite know, where am I trying to fit? What am I trying to do? What are the things that teachers as mentors or other leaders in the college can look for to say, this is maybe what's going on, and what's something practical that they can do as a leader in their classroom, in their institution, when they see this?
Yeah, well, that's related to, I suppose, how I was able to escape some of those traps too, because a really important part of my story is that when I made it out of high school and I was in college, I went to Humber College in Toronto. That was the community college system was my changing point, right? I mean, that is where I got a different kind of support than I had ever experienced before. And what worked well, I think, above all, is making sure that a young person, whether you're concerned about him or her or not, has dialogue in their life, meaning that they're talking to adults about what they're reading when they're by themselves, how they feel, what they're experiencing. Because what that does is it gives them the opportunity to share what's going on in their lives and the kinds of distractions that might be sucking up their energy and taking them away from the discipline they need in order to do well. But what it also means is that it gives them a chance to be challenged, right? It's very different, I think, between articulating an idea to someone else and seeing how they respond to it versus sitting by yourself on a phone or an iPad and thinking you understand the way the world works by yourself, right? Mm-hmm. I actually think a lot about when the Charlottesville rally happened a couple of years ago and led to a young protester being killed by an extremist. A bunch of post-secondary students, university students, college students were involved in that. And a lot of them were embarrassed because their faces came out, right, as rally attendees, right, as white supremacists. And the reason that always sticks with me is because they had never before actually been associated with their beliefs, because no one had ever talked to them about these things. They had never had to look at someone's face and say, this is what I believe, right? Mm-hmm. I'm a racist. I believe in these things. Instead, it was an online culture. They're by themselves. They're with their peers who are telling them this is the right way to look at the world. And then they go and they wind up on TV, and it's like they're shocked by what it feels like when people look at you and know what you're believing and what you're thinking privately. Right. And that's an extreme example. But what that I think is revealing is that when you build those connections with adults and you're able to have that dialogue, you don't go so far before you realize I'm actually embarrassed by what I think is true.
Or the ideas aren't well founded.
Exactly.
Or, you haven't had a chance to test those arguments with somebody else, because when you went to test it in that closed group, you were always successful. And having that ability to have a difficult conversation. Because for me, that's one of the things that really struck me throughout your book, is that you're touching on things in this book. This book would catch fire in certain circles just because you're talking frankly about issues that people just right now, and I know in your podcast, they would self-censor the discussion. They wouldn't even bring up the discussion to talk about it. but those really complicated discussions need to be had so that we can get meaningful solutions to problems.
Precisely. And that's where the idea of dialogue comes in, right? Because it's like, are you creating space for people to say what they're thinking and believing, or are you only creating space for people to say what you'd like them to say, right? And that's a really important difference.
Right.
If someone has a flawed way of understanding the world and comes into your school, right, and comes to your classroom or enters your workplace, the idea should be that they are sharing what they're thinking. And if that's a concern, then you can work with them to challenge their mind, right? But otherwise, you're creating spaces that are exclusive to people. And even if they have the wrong ideas, the ability to articulate them is important, I think.
And it's interesting at the college, one of the things we've been talking about with our leaders is how do you create the right environment to, one, have difficult conversations, but two, talk about failures in a way that isn't going to expose you to the point where you're not willing to bring it forward, but that we actually learn from it. And if you create an environment where only this type of thinking is okay, you're not going to encourage the conversation about, well, what didn't work because we went down this road? And to me, it's a very interesting dilemma and possibility in an institution when we're trying to be very, very entrepreneurial. We're trying to say to leaders, you know, we expect good outcomes. We expect people to work hard. And we also expect you to fail and talk about failing. And if you are not comfortable having that open conversation about failing, one, how will we ever know we made a mistake? And two, how do we actually ever move forward? And I see synergy there with what you're saying, because if you cannot have a conversation, how can you ever propel your employees, your leadership skills, and therefore your organization? And for us, it's really about changing lives and transforming communities. And I'm so glad you gave a really good plug for Humber College, because community colleges do make a difference.
Absolutely.
They create that.
Yeah. No, I one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I think we're all on the same vibe. We're all agreeing with each other, and which is the danger of what we need to create some controversy. But I specifically wanted to ask you about, in your one of your books, you talk about a point in your life where it resonated with you that your moral compass was in a different position than a fellow named Lucas. And I found that very captivating, because if you look through in the military, we've had specific moral challenges that we've had to face. And we've got certain rules and regulations and concepts. And some people will argue, where their morals fit and how it fits in. But the only person that understands that is the individual. And they learn that from the environment that they're in and their belief structure and everything else. And I know that's a big component in your chapter there. Could you expand on that? Because I found that very captivating, that part of the book.
Yeah, well, what I write about there is when my best friend at the time wound up getting into trouble with the justice system and seeing his crimes described in a Crime Stoppers press release, and just seeing how other people might perceive him and understand his behavior was very jarring. And that's where it kind of dawned on me that some of the morals that I had taken for granted as making sense to us in our particular context didn't make much sense when you push yourself outside of that little bubble we lived in, right? That being violent is actually pretty inexcusable. But we had in this subculture that celebrates gangs and criminals, I think it had been normalized to us in a way that was disturbing, or I came to see as disturbing. But on the idea of a moral compass, I mean, a lot of it came, I think, in my life from having people who I thought I didn't pay much attention to, people who I thought weren't a big influence on me at the time, right? Like a mom that I had, who was the only one of my two parents who stuck around. And I spent so much time as a kid being angry about the parent that wasn't there that I didn't really think too much about the parent who was. And those moments where my moral compass kicked in, I think, came from the fact that I had a mom who, was a person who tried to teach us right and took care of her kids and gave us an example that we could look at of how you take responsibility for your family and do the right thing. And at the moment, I didn't see her as the source of much of anything. But I think that as I've gotten older, I can look back and say that like her sticking with me and being that example really mattered. And in ways that I still probably to this day don't fully understand.
Yeah, because it's the environment that's been created, that positive environment.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about the Citizen Empowerment Project. Tell us what it is, what you hope to achieve through it, and what you're doing with it.
Yeah, so the CEP is a nonprofit organization that I started when I moved back to Toronto after law school. And what we wanted to do was give people access to educational opportunities so they could get some of the empowerment that I had experienced in law school, right? So the best thing I got out of law school, and I think the best thing out of my education at large, was a better understanding of how the world works, right? So if you see a problem in your society, what are the different ways you might actually be able to change it? Where does decision-making power exist, right? The city, the province, the federal government. What are things that the private sector can do? What are things that judges can do, or members of parliament, or right? Like this like division of responsibility in how our world is shaped is something that most people, I don't think, get a clear understanding of until they're later on in their life, right? Which is why, for instance, the voting patterns of young people tend to be so different as compared to how the elder folks in our society. The younger you are, the less likely you are to vote, the less likely you are to pay attention to a lot of like kind of formal party politics, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we wanted to do was just create opportunities for people to learn about those things earlier on in their lives and then train them to have some of the skills they would need to actually go out and affect change. The first set of issues that we worked on were related to law enforcement and policing, and in particular, over-policing in low-income and mostly minority neighborhoods in the Toronto area. And so what that meant was helping build programs that young people could come to where they could learn, well, if you want to change policing, who has that power? And what is the difference between changing law enforcement versus changing the law? And then training them with some of the advocacy skills they might need to go out and meet with a police officer or meet with a city councilor or a member of parliament and talk about what are the specific changes you're asking them to lead. And then when you go to the ballot box and you turn 18, how do you make an informed decision about what's going to change your community for the better from your particular perspective? To me, the work we do is a balance of what I really believe in, which is to empower people on an individual level, because that's who we are ultimately as citizens, but so that they understand how exercising their individuality affects their neighbor, their friend, their mom, their dad, their brother, their sister. And that is the balance that we've tried to articulate in our work, that we're building individual leaders, but who have compassion and a heart for the people they share their community with.
Right. So I'm hearing individual skill development, but really how they will influence and build their society, because as they garner those individual advocacy skills, and I'm hearing principles, and the ability to push, right? Because in advocacy, you have to have an opinion, not just an opinion. It should be backed up by some good facts, because the evidence is important. But then it's if each individual person can take these views forward and they're well grounded, you will influence community and you'll have more followers, really, because you're going to create a groundswell that will begin to change communities. Fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Wow, that was a good answer. Good answer. I wanted to sort of shape it a bit into discussion about, on one of your podcasts, you talked about the easiness that people can generalize about culture and economic situation and class to make broad-based concepts that are not necessarily tested on the ground about viable solutions. We often talk about Toronto. I grew up Kill and Shepherd myself, but on the base side. So I know there was a difference. You crossed over Kiel, and there was a different community. And it never should have been that way. There's these definitive lines, but everybody made generalizations, and I never saw the whole time I lived there. I was only there for a couple of years, but I never saw really good solutions. It was just them over there, this over there, all the different sort of circle communities, and in some cases, immigrant communities within immigrant communities. And all of them sort of doing their own thing, but no one having frank discussions about how we can solve the problems that were happening there because it was too politically correct or it was too, you self-censor those discussions. And I don't think they ever got until even so recently gotten to a place where they're starting to get solutions.
Yeah, I think there's a real gap between, and I try to be careful not to use overly divisive language when I describe this, but I think there's a gap between what you might call, let's say, like kind of cultural and social elites in our society, right? So, and I say that fully recognizing that in some cases that includes me too, right? People who have an inordinate amount of institutional power, who have influence to decision making, right? I think there's a gap between those folks in our society and a lot of the people who are on the ground experiencing the social issues that I think define our politics of the day. So when we're talking about class, for instance, I think it's really obvious to me, at least, that like class barely comes up in news media, right? It's just not something that people cover. Journalists don't seem attuned to talking about class issues very often. But what they are used to talking about is what you could maybe call like identity politics. You're more likely to hear things about race or gender or sexuality than you are about the class divisions in our society. And I think that in large part is because that's how people who occupy these elite spaces, that's how they see themselves. These elite spaces aren't very class diverse, but they are diverse in some of these other ways. And so it makes sense that that's how they see the world, right? But what that means in practice is a lot of the challenges that are very acute on the ground, right? And when I say on the ground, I mean in schools, among young people, in that's challenges social service providers face, challenges that grassroots activists and community organizers might encounter, are things that don't get attention from folks who control resources.
Yeah, they're not being funded.
Exactly.
Not being
so,
funded,
yeah, one of the biggest examples to me is family breakdown, right? There's not a single school that I go to, and I've had the privilege over the last few months of speaking to probably 15,000 students across Canada. There's not a school I go to where I don't have young people who want to talk about what it's like to grow up in a broken home because it's such a pervasive challenge. And it looks different for different people, but the feeling a young person has when things aren't working right between your parents, that on a gut level is very shared by a lot of them, right? A lot of us.
And statistically, that's increasing. Too.
Exactly.
It's not going down.
Yeah. And yet, like I would say the number of programs responding to that, the number of policy initiatives responding to that is not growing as that trend increases, right? And I think that's because a lot of the folks who have that institutional power, they're not concerned about those issues. They don't see them. They're not exposed to them. It's just not part of their life. So that's what concerns me about those divisions, right? Both in terms of geography, but also in terms of culture, is that we're not seeing an adequate response to things that I think are very relevant to the folks that, in theory, we are all supposed to be concerned about, right? Which is the children that are going to like lead our country in the future.
Yeah, like school sizes and things like that in Toronto and some of the communities in Toronto. That kids are on a bus for an hour to go to school. When they could, if adequately funded, build a school that would be closer. Or in your book, you talk about the charter school systems and those issues about how some places are all about them and some people are dead set against them.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting with what you say, because when you think about challenges in a family breakup, what we tend to do is we take the most extreme of the fallout. So we deal with family violence, or we try to, right? We try to support people who are in that situation. We try to support on the child welfare side, but we don't actually ever talk about what's happening in the family and the challenge of a family and the breakup of a family. So what we're doing almost is, well, maybe not almost, maybe we are doing, is we're trying to put the Band-Aid on the severe very public, sometimes public, very noticeable piece. So there's a violence issue, so we're going to do something about that. But are we really going to the root of the problem? And that's a challenge. That's a challenge in how do we build strong societies? How do we build respect for individuals? How do we create role models to get individuals to help in those situations? And it goes right back to how do we have those conversations? Because when you think about the family unit, that's quite private. Right? Like it's something that you don't really go there, because even as a woman who's been married 36 years, my husband and I can have conversations, but I'm usually not going to bring those conversations to work on, what's really going well or what's not going well, because it's private. So it's an interesting piece on how do you almost whittle your way in there to have the conversation so that you can actually understand the root of the problem rather than we'll give you a solution. Because I think part of our challenge in society right now, we want a solution for everything. One, because I think there's a lot of smart people out there. People want to be seen as doing good and being able to say, I solved the problem. But maybe it's leading to not enough of the right conversation to get us there.
I know discussions we've had before about good public policy. There's people feeling the need to do something to be seen or perceived as taking action, balanced against, is that really good public policy? And I know, like in Toronto, that's a constant problem. My folks live in Ontario. It's a constant problem, that argument between good public policy and being seen or perceived to be taking action.
Yeah, and that is a defining challenge of politics generally, I think, right? Is when you're in the business of being given a job mostly on perception, I think sometimes it demands political leaders to want more from themselves, even if that's not what the political environment's asking them for, right? That means sometimes you have to make tough decisions that might not be super popular at the time, but that's because you have a vision for something that's going to be good for the society that you're given the privilege of helping lead, right? And I think that kind of political courage is lacking too often these days, and it would be nice to see more of it.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways that's the biggest challenge of our day today is public policy. There's lots of policy initiatives, and you're seeing such a bipolar relationship in the States, which, as you note again in your book, that no matter what we do, leaks up through culture, art, music, leaks into Canada, that we get the same sort of bipolar approach to politics when really most people are probably in the middle and in that middle ground, but we're hearing the more vocal sort of fringe elements are making the vocal arguments on social media, where really the ground truth, most people aren't as bad as described, and the generations aren't as bad. And there are actually a lot of really, really good people. And I think sometimes we miss that when we're trying to deal with really complex problems, because we can't even get to the discussion point because we've already taken a side and you're immovable on your side. So there's no way we can have those discussions. Right?
Yeah, I think we live in a time where actually one of the defining characteristics of good leadership is just having enough of a backbone that when the fringes are loud and they come for you and they come for you with vitriol, you're able to take that, right, and just keep doing what you think is right. And I wish we didn't live in a time where that perhaps of such a low bar was expected of us, but I think that's the case right now, that having a backbone and standing behind what you believe goes a long way.
I really noticed that. Like, we did a podcast on social media, and I wasn't really into Twitter, and I said, okay, I'm going to give it a go. And I find it really, really hard to sort of follow on Twitter, because I find it the vitriol and the hate and the anger. There's some good stuff in there. Don't get me wrong. There's a good belt of information in there. But there's so many people that are just, that's what they do, and they just posting mean and just throwing stuff out. And the fact that they're anonymous doesn't help either.
What a recent pattern that's really bothered me is seeing young authors, so sometimes in their late teens, early 20s, who write young adult fiction for the most part. In the last couple of months, there's been 2 examples of high-profile young authors who were going to release a highly anticipated debut novel, cancel their book release because they were convinced by a Twitter mob that they were too insensitive to a certain political issue. And it's really heartbreaking to see, and it makes me think that a big part of the training that young leaders, especially those who are going to be more public, as artists, as business people, whatever it might be, need to be trained on how to handle that criticism. Because when you're the subject of that, what you're talking about on Twitter, it can rock you, and you feel alone because the probably majority of people who are on Twitter who don't have those negative things to say about you, they're not commenting, with the same enthusiasm, right? Mm-hmm. To remind you that you're actually a good person and you're doing something well. And so it feels like you're by yourself and so isolating, and seeing those examples of bright young people kind of cave to that, it really bugs me. And I hope that those of us who are who are trying to build strong young leaders start to become more aware, myself included, of how we can help people prepare for those challenges.
Well, and I think part of that is preparing young people for failure, preparing them for criticism, because if you're going to be a leader in society, you will have criticism. And actually, we need leaders who can take the criticism and, as you said, stick to their values, stick to the plan. And I think where we have very polarizing issues, and it seems more and more people will grab the extreme. And I don't know if it's because people are lost or that they just need to have something really strong to hang on to, whether it's good strong or bad strong. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a leader and you have to have a good backbone, yes, but how do you also gather that middle ground so that you can find something that is, and it goes back to the common ground, something that might bring this extreme view and this extreme view. There are some people you just will never get to the middle. That won't happen. But how do we create more harmony? We have to have a leader that's going to push through. Because you have to have values, principles. Here's where I'm going. This is where I'm going to go. And particularly political leaders, because we need them to have vision and to take us on a journey that will be good for all of us in society. But we also need to know how do we draw that common ground? How do we actually get back to, I would say, good humanity and respecting people's thoughts and opinions and values to get there?
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the great things about podcasting to me is that it's opened up a lane for kind of long form, detailed conversation. And it shows that, when you're having a cable news style conversation where you've got 8 minutes to say, why the other person's completely wrong, and then they have time to explain why it creates a certain kind of environment for public discourse that is inevitably just about the conflict. And that's actually where you seek your validation, is how many people you're fighting with, right? But these long form conversations that podcasts create, right? And my favorite podcasts all do a really good job at this, is just, it gives you the space to fully say what you think and fully explore a subject. And by the end of it, you realize that when you give people the time, that you will spotlight all the things that you have in common. It makes it so much easier to see that, on the edges, there might be certain things we disagree on, but we have a similar goal, right? In terms of where we'd like the world to be. We'd like the similar things for everybody. And, knowing that creates, I think, a basis for dialogue and collaboration that's a lot easier.
I wanted to ask you a couple questions on in your book again. I'm quoting your book, but I think everybody should read it. I really enjoyed it. It's a good, easy read. It's got great information, and it's research. It's not just a fiction novel. It's got numbers in there. But what I thought was interesting from an education point of view was the reverse gender gap in education. And I thought that was something we should discuss, because it's interesting enough, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 60% women at NorQuest College. And in some of the medical fields, it's even greater than that. It's like 80% of the women in some of the medical fields. And when we talk about the reverse education gap, that there's this gap of men, young men, doing education.
Yeah. When we talk about gender gaps, whether it's the traditional way we talk about it in terms of women being underrepresented or the reverse gender gap, I always like to remind people that I don't think there needs to be some sort of perfect quota, right? Not every program should be 50-50 because people have their own individual interests, right? To me, where the reverse gender gap is relevant is just to show that the traditional institutions that we might have historically relied on for men to be encouraged, to be provided role models, to be prepared for the future, they might not have the same resonance with men today that they used to have, right? So if we know that fewer men are going to college and university than, let's say, in the past, well, where are those men going? Like, that's, to me, the interesting question. And where are they getting their inspiration and their role models and their instruction from if they're disengaged from school? And so that's, to me, where the interesting point is. I never like to argue that, I'd like, more men should be going to university. We should.
Yeah, no,
be
I wasn't.
redu-
I
yeah.
wasn't.
No,
I'm
I know.
just
I know.
saying that here's an example where there's a
I
dichotomy
didn't think
there.
you intended that. I just want to make sure that I clarify that, because sometimes that's how people hear it.
Yeah.
And but what I find, I guess, most important to recognize from those statistics is just, I think too often we have a cultural default where we assume that men feel empowered and feel like they have access to opportunity. And I think that that's not the case. And I don't know when that might have shifted or if it was ever true, but I do think it's really important to underscore that a lot of men need to be encouraged, right? A lot of boys need to be told, you can do these things. You are good enough. You are capable. And to whatever extent the reverse gender gap is a reflection of maybe too many boys not thinking they can do those things as opposed to choosing not to. That's where what I'm concerned about. And I do worry about that a lot, that even our prime minister uses language often that I think would lead you to think that boys are this kind of uniformly privileged and empowered, 50% of our population, or roughly so. And that's just not true. There are a lot of boys that are struggling, right? And there are boys that do really well and are, granted a lot of opportunity and support. But there are plenty, and these are the boys I probably disproportionately interact with, a lot of boys that are struggling and don't believe in themselves and are, depressed and think they have a bleak future ahead of them. And so the reverse gender gap is, I think, a reminder that we should never oversimplify those things, right? That
generalize. Shouldn't generalize.
Exactly.
There is no generalization. It's a complex issue.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. The other piece in your book is you talked a lot about how often as you were growing up you felt minimized. So as you went through the challenges of life, did a big turnaround, really. Going to Yale Law School is a really, really big deal, and you should be very proud of that. How did that experience of feeling minimized, how did you catalyze that and turn that around in the other way, so that, and maybe it wasn't a catalyst for you, but I always look at it as I was in a situation where I was told in high school that I would not go to college, I would not go to university because I wasn't smart enough. And for me, that was actually a catalyzing moment, because I had a very strong mother who said, you can do whatever you want. And, I have a PhD. I went through all of that process. Was it easy? No, because I wasn't a strong academic student. So I had to work really hard for it. But those very words of that, very inappropriate counselor became a catalyst for me. So did your experience of being minimized, did that ever turn into a catalyst for you?
It did. I think a lot of the reason I felt that way is because of where I was seeking respect and admiration. So I didn't feel like I was getting it at home, right? I didn't feel like I was getting it at school because I didn't fit in. I didn't do what the teachers wanted me to do, so I didn't feel like I was being valued when I would go to school every day. And so I sought it from a peer group that encouraged me to do things that probably weren't good for me or for them, right? And where I started to get that respect and admiration from people who actually had good intentions in my life, people who wanted me to do well, that's where my transformation started to begin, right? When I remember very vividly the day I got my first B+ on something, and it was in college. And that day just sticks with me because it was the first time I felt like I had done something that deserved praise in an academic environment. And it became, just as it was so normal for me to get, D's and C's and F's, in high school, when I got that B plus, it created a feeling I wanted to chase, because I started to feel like, okay, I feel good. People are saying something good about me. People think highly of me. I want more of that. I like being treated with that kind of respect. I liked being admired in that way. So the minimization, I think, came from thinking that I couldn't get that feeling from the adults in my life. And once I had adults who figured out how to communicate with me effectively enough where I trusted that if I wanted their admiration, I could get it. If I wanted their respect, it was possible. I just had to do my part. Once I had those people in my life, it just created a whole new way of thinking about the world.
So it's interesting in the college, one of our values is our value of people, and one of the, I guess, sub-values, and for me the most important value is in respect. And I have a conversation with new employees. Every time I do new employee orientation, I talk about the value of respect. And you'll hear the saying that respect is earned. I have a very different point of view on that. I believe respect is a basic human quality, and everyone deserves respect. Now, you can take the extreme of that somebody's murdered someone. Okay, you can take the extreme of that. But part of what I'm hearing you say is you got the B plus. With that became admiration and respect. So if we started from it with our employees saying, we respect you, we respect everything you can bring to the table, you're starting here instead of at the bottom and trying to build up. And so I look at it as, if we start with the view that I'm going to respect you and you are going to respect me, what I am hopeful of is that that's going to lead to even more respect, and you're going to be more motivated to achieve for our organization, because we are changing lives and strengthening communities. And I see it as something, can we not start in this good place versus having to earn it? And I particularly think that as a child, because as a child, you want to be noticed. You want to be admired. You want to have the pat on the back. And so I always put it out there to say, can we start here? Because I think it's a great place to start.
Which is always fun in our conversations. You could draw a direct parallel, change some of those words, and we talk about the armed forces.
Well, I was going to ask you that. Respect must have a very particular meaning in the work you do.
Yeah, and we've been really working in the armed forces to try to do the same, sort of idea that everybody's a member of the team, and everybody's a valued member. And and once in a while we'll have an incident where we have to sit back and question that and look at it and say, okay, clearly we're not talking about our culture, talking about what's important and what the value is. And what I've always been struck by the armed forces is that throughout my time, I can tell you stories of people who had very difficult lives and background. And what the great thing about the armed forces is you inherit a very detailed and structured family. And for some people, structure and that environment and respect and all that is something that's organic to our organization. And I think very much in NorQuest College too, it's the same ideal. And I really think that for some young people, post-secondary education, armed forces service, national service is one of those things that gives that purpose. Because I'm a firm believer that purpose is probably one of the most important things in our lives. We in your book, you describe it different ways, and I know Jody and we all described it. But at the end of the day, to drill it down to, if you have purpose and you have definition of what you wanted to do, I knew from a very young age I wanted to be in the armed forces, and that was it. And my son, who's ice climbing in a mountain someplace, is looking for his purpose. If I didn't have that purpose, right now I could not tell you what path I would have taken, where I would have gone, because that was. Once I figured it out, it was all encompassing. I was able to succeed. I wasn't a great student. I didn't able to do it. But when I got my purpose, everything came. And I sense from your story, it was the same thing. When you had found your purpose, sort of everything came together.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When you start to feel, there's something very important, I think, to feeling useful too, right? Yeah. And that's where the purpose comes in. It's like you start to feel like, okay, like what I'm doing means something to somebody. And that feeling, when you chase it, it can take you to really special places.
Yeah, and that's the respect bit that Jody was talking about. Yeah. That you're a respected member of the team, and your purpose is to, in this case, to educate and assist people in those growth as an individual grows. I think that's what's amazing about NorQuest College is you see all these people and they're all here to improve their lives and move along. And I just think that's a fantastic component of the school, armed forces, what you're doing. We're all sort of on the same sheet of music, which is really cool.
So, Jamil, I think we're getting to the end of our podcast time, and I would just ask if there's one key message that you would like the listeners to take from you, what would it be?
Buy your book.
Sure.
Sorry.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Why Young Men is the book.
Yeah, buy the book. Yeah.
Well, that is a good one. But I guess in addition to buy the book, one of the reasons I like to start a lot of my conversations recognizing kind of who I was as a teenager and where I kind of came from is because I hope it reminds people of the importance of redemption, right? That sometimes we meet people or find people at certain periods of their life and they're just not the best version of themselves. But especially the young people in our society have so much time and potential to turn that around. And if anyone who ever thinks something highly of me remembers that, they should also remember that, there was a time not too long ago where you wouldn't have seen any of those good qualities in me and where I was buried in a school system and in a family situation where no one knew what I was capable of or what I could learn or any of the talents and abilities that I had. So I think there's a lot of young people like that. And I hope that we keep our minds open to the redemption stories that they're going to be able to tell as well.
So everyone has potential and there are possibilities.
Yeah.
And again, I'd really like to thank you for coming out in the book. And I'll give you a good plug on that. I'm not. There's a bit of a joke here because normally I don't come really super prepared for these. I normally have some thoughts, but I really got immersed in your book, and it's one of the few books I've read, finished it, and then went back and started again because I felt I hadn't gotten the full depth and flavor of the information that you provided in there. Plus being on a treadmill, kind of, your mind wanders a bit. But an exceptional book and really well done, and I commend you for that. And I also really enjoy your podcast. And I think, again, I'd like to plug your podcast, The Road Home. The people should listen to it because the style and the people, it's just so frank, and I think that's what I liked about it. Young people talking about their mental health experiences. It's an Indigenous leader talking about how he turned his life around, that redemption moment, especially the one, the community safety one, which I think is a must listen to, how they turned a community around where no one could figure out how to solve the problem in the Winnipeg area, with the Indigenous community, and that podcast really articulates a really frank discussion about stuff, which I think in a lot of days today in politics and a lot of things, we're just not having these discussions. We're just glossing over the meaty issues and not solving things. So thank you for this. I think you've done a great service by writing this book.
I appreciate that, and thank you for having me here at NorQuest.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Leadership in Challenging Times with Dr. Jody Abbott and Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Wilson on the NorQuest College podcast. Any questions or suggestions on any episodes can be directed to us at podcast@norquest.ca. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please remember to subscribe using iTunes or Google Play and get updated when the new episodes become available. Thanks for listening.